Good, I think we'll make a start. I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of this Adelphi book, China's Cyber Power, by my colleague Nigel Inkster, who's Director of Future Conflict and Cyber Security here at the ISS. This Adelphi book grew out of and builds on a series of lectures Nigel gave about a year or two ago here at the Institute, and listening to the analysis that he was developing and the arguments that he was generating, we felt it was really important to capture that and to elaborate that, and this Adelphi book is the product of it. Obviously, Nigel is somebody who brings pretty special qualities to this analytical task. He has been following China all his analytical life, and he's got a very substantial career behind him as an intelligence professional as well, and that does give him a certain analytical toolkit that he's more than drawn on in producing this volume. At the ISS, we are in the process of developing a program called China's Strategic Arrival, and cyber arguably is one of those areas in which China's arrival is rather palpable, both in terms of the capabilities that it is developing as a military and an intelligence power of international stature and growing global reach, but also in the sense that cyber is one of those things that gives China the ability to shape a strategically important domain, an information domain, in a way that potentially affects all the rest of us. And if that isn't a metric of strategic arrival, I don't know what is. I think this Adelphi book is particularly successful in addressing two principal audiences and trying to bring them together. One of those audiences is the technological expert community who are following developments in cyber technology and international cyber power on an ongoing basis. And for them, what this book does is to provide an insight into the geopolitical, political, security context for what they observe on a daily or monthly basis. And then the second audience is really that of the generic strategist or even the sinologist, who is then given through this account a sense of the kinds of capabilities China is developing, capabilities that might in some way probably will, in fact are, shaping its strategic behavior in future. And to that extent, this book is treating cyber as a kind of a thread, almost a sort of thread of Ariadne, through which China's strategic mindset can be observed, its interests can be observed, and also monitored. So Nigel, I'll hand over to you to make the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. As Adam said, this book arose out of a series of lectures that I presented here at IISS last year, and which reflected research and paradiplomatic activity that I had been engaged in on and to a degree with China for some while before that. As Adam said, I've been kind of following China pretty consistently since the early 1970s, when I began my undergraduate studies, and I've been engaged with the China issue directly at various points in my professional career. I've also tried to keep up to speed with developments in this country, in that country, which is a really difficult thing to do. I've long since come to the conclusion that there can no longer be such a thing as a generic China expert, any more than there can be such a thing as a generic Europe expert or an American expert. You have to have a much more focused set of expertise, but that has to be anchored to a broader, more generic understanding. And I think what I've tried to do, as Adam said, in this book, is to look at Well, let's put it another. Let's start from another perspective. At the time that I began to write this book, international opinion was very, very much focused on one facet of China's activity within the cyber domain, and this was the whole question of Chinese state-sponsored industrial cyber espionage. And there was a point, maybe 2 years, 18 months ago, when the newspapers contained enormous amounts of column inches dealing with this particular phenomenon. In the book, I do obviously spend quite a lot of time looking at this issue in its own right and trying to situate it in a broader context. But what I'm really trying to do in this book is something much wider, which is to situate China's emergence as, to quote the words of President Xi Jinping, a big cyber power now focusing on becoming a strong cyber power in the broader context of China's long struggle for modernity and cultural self-respect. And in a nutshell, I think this is what really what this is all about. And the cyber domain has become mission critical for China's plans for its future social and economic development, in particular the economic development, where the Chinese government has a massive imperative to work to avoid China falling into a middle income trap and confronting all the social instability and dislocation that might arise if that trap is not avoided. It's also transformed China's intelligence community, who all of a sudden have a reach and access to volumes of data that even 15 years ago would have been unimaginable for them. And it is now seen as integral as to how China's armed forces will conduct future warfare. It's also increasingly central to China's efforts to exercise greater say in matters of global governance and global security, and to assert a value system which is very different from that which has dominated the global discourse since the end of World War II. In doing so, the book seeks to address some of the key strategic issues now occupying the global policy community about what sort of power a newly emergent China will become, whether China's rise can be accommodated without undue dislocation to the status quo, and what will be the long-term strategic impact of China's emergence as a global economic and increasingly military power. The cyber domain is both one area within which China seeks to exercise power, but it is also an integrator and, sorry, I can't read very well, as you can see from my glasses, and enabler of China's levers of power and its pursuit of modernity. And when we talk about modernity in the Chinese context, it's worth reminding ourselves that the vision we have today of a China consisting of ultra-modern, high-rise megacities linked by extensive road, rail, and air networks is a model of development that really only consolidated itself in the mid-1990s, which is exactly the time at which the internet arrived in China. In the rush to make up for all the time that was lost at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and this was a period during which, let us not forget, China's share of global GDP declined from about 5% to roughly 1%. China's leadership China's leadership was from the outset aware of the potential of information and communications technologies, then still in a somewhat embryonic state, to promote economic modernization. Interestingly, a key influence here was that of the US futurologist Alvin Toffler, whose works, The Third Wave and Future Shock, were eagerly devoured by China's intelligentsia and leadership. And I actually remember, as a young diplomat in Beijing in the 1980s, handing out these copies of these books almost like confetti to everyone that I came into contact with. And Toffler was remarkably prescient, in particular, in his analysis of how information communications technology would have a transformational effect on human existence. And this, I think, was important in determining the eventual direction of the internet in China, because if you think about the United States, once the United States government had privatized ARPANET and deregulated a rather sclerotic domestic telecommunications industry, it effectively stood aside and let the private sector do what it could with this new technology. In China, by contrast, the development of the internet was as much as anything the product of a series of top-down, government-led initiatives. And that those initiatives progressively moved China, and very rapidly, into the digital age. And much of this early activity necessarily involved very close cooperation with major US technology companies, and China rapidly established itself as the information communication technologies manufacturing hub for the planet. Microsoft software, a lot of it pirated, became the norm for Chinese users, including government departments. But as has happened with pretty much every phase of China's economic development and modernization, much unplanned and unanticipated private sector innovation took place. And we saw many young Chinese students who'd learnt their trade in Western universities and in Silicon Valley coming back to China to set up some of the companies that have now become established global brands. The result, as in the West, was a period of chaotic creativity. The agenda now is about imposing some degree of order on the chaos. As the internet became more widespread in China, at first through the medium of internet cafes, but more recently through mobile devices and an explosion of social media, the Chinese authorities faced a dilemma. The transformational role these technologies played in all areas of national life was balanced by the threat posed to the Communist Party's authority, legitimacy, and narrative by potentially unconstrained information flows that challenged the party's narrative. And the response was evolutionary, as was the technology, but is best summed up by the term coined by US researcher Rebecca McKinnon as networked authoritarianism. An acceptance that in the information era, China's population would have access to more information than had traditionally been possible, and would use the new technologies to express thoughts that previously would not have been countenanced. The most practical solution to deal with these was a combination of filtering externally generated content via what has become known as the Great Firewall of China, referred to in China itself as the Golden Shield Project. Right. insistence that China's internet companies and service providers should police their own content in accordance with regulations that were so broad brush as to be pretty much all-encompassing, and the use of an army of censors enabled by increasingly sophisticated information technology systems to monitor and, where necessary, delete internally generated content. And this was combined with an equally large army of government employees, referred to in China, actually rather misleadingly, as the 50-cent party, to engage in debates on social media and steer potentially contentious conversations towards safer ground. It's been described as a cat and mouse game, a term I've used myself, and it's generated an entire lexicography of terms used by China's netizens to talk about these various forms of censorship. But I have to say, it seems increasingly clear that the cat is winning. And China's authorities appear to believe, in my view correctly, that they have sufficient technology dominance to maintain control of the public discourse. There are, of course, ways in which restrictions can be circumvented, but those seeking to do so are relatively few in number and are easily identified and monitored by the Chinese state. China's netizens are free to let off steam, but in a safe and controlled environment in which the party can often take credit for appearing to be responsive to popular concerns that are articulated in social media. The concerns that have driven this controlling approach to the cyber domain, emulated to varying degrees by other authoritarian states, have achieved increasing salience in recent years and increasingly inform China's behavior both at home and abroad. Since 1989, the Chinese state has sought through its patriotic education system to promote a narrative of victimhood and grievance around the so-called century of humiliation, the Bainian Guochi. Combined with this has been a narrative of the West seeking to undermine China and to plot the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party through a process that has been termed peaceful evolution. And this mindset is perhaps best exemplified by a video put out by the National Defense University of China in 2012 entitled Silent Contest, over the course of 2 hours to the theme of the theme music from the Game of Thrones. You see a succession of senior Chinese policymakers, including 3 serving generals, talking about the subversive threats to which China is vulnerable. And in recent years, we've seen the incidence of newspaper and magazine articles talking about threats from so-called hostile foreign forces, 外来敌对势力, has grown. And the most recent example, actually I've got it here with me, find it, is an article in the day before yesterday's People's Daily by the well-known ideologue and propagandist Tian Jin, who, using language not heard since the Maoist era, at least to my knowledge, emphasizes the imperative necessity of the party exercising control over all forms of media and of media workers not deviating one iota from party directions on what can be published, broadcast, or posted on social media. A lot of this, we should remind ourselves, is bound up with efforts by Xi Jinping to strengthen loyalty and discipline within a Chinese Communist Party that is engulfed by levels of corruption that are seen as potentially existential to this party's survival and hold on power. but they have had a significant wider impact on public perceptions within China, which has have become at their worst rabidly, we've seen at its worst rabid expressions of right-wing nationalist sentiment on the part of netizens, and on China's foreign and security policies more generally. In the cyber domain, this is translated into a more forceful and extrovert espousal of the concepts of information security and cyber sovereignty. In essence, the right of states to determine what information their populations can access, and this is something to which I'll return in a moment. I'd now like to move on to the issue that has attracted the most global attention and generated the most column inches in recent years, which is the question of Chinese state-sponsored industrial cyber espionage. And the list of cyber intrusions that have been laid at China's door is very long, and there are many lower-level exploits that have never made their way into the headlines. And throughout all the publicity, China's foreign ministry has resolutely maintained China's innocence and has emphasized the extent to which China itself has been the victim of cyber attacks, an assertion reinforced by the revelations of rogue NSA contractor Edward Snowden, of whom more in a moment. But there is a powerful body of circumstantial evidence pointing to China as the culprit for many of these intrusions. The sheer volume of attacks, which virtually no other state or non-state group could possibly be expected to match. The extent to which priority collection targets have mapped closely the priorities in China's successive 5-year plans, and the fact that many intrusions seem to be organized around the rhythms of the Chinese working day, including generous lunch breaks and time for a nap in the afternoon. In private, Chinese security officials have acknowledged that these activities are taking place and are justified both by China's national security imperative to accelerate economic development, to ensure social stability, and as a consequence of the West's track record of denying China access to advanced technologies, a claim which is, to some degree, but only partly justified. Moreover, we've had the testimony of Snowden himself, an unlikely hero in this particular context, who has explained that US intelligence community had identified and penetrated some of these exploits coming from China, and had effectively made itself a silent copy addressee on all the correspondence and activity that was taking place on these particular networks. So China has sought refuge in the assertion that the complexity of the cyber domain has made attribution of exploits an impossible task. Well, the truth is that it is difficult, but not impossible, to attribute attacks, and it's actually getting easier. The issue is that states with the capacity to establish attribution to a high level of certainty will generally not want to reveal the capabilities that make such attribution possible, nor, actually, under international law, are they required to do so if they wish to seek retaliation for what they perceive as wrongful acts against them. The only thing international law requires is that any retaliation be proportionate to the harm that is perceived. And for a number of years, it seemed that the United States in particular was impotent in the face of this tsunami of attacks. Part of the problem undoubtedly lies with the Western business community in particular, whose leaders showed a startling, I would argue in some cases bordering on criminal, lack of attention to the issue of cybersecurity. But there was also a more important point, which is essentially an asymmetry of vulnerability. Put at its bluntest, there was a lot less that the West wanted to steal from China than China wanted to steal from the West. And both the private sector and governments were loath to make too much an issue of a problem for fear that it would adversely affect wider interests and business opportunities. The dam only broke in 2013 with a report by the US company Mandiant into the activities of the Shanghai-based 3PLA unit 61398, 5 of whose officers were subsequently made the subject of a US Department of Justice indictment. This marked the beginning of a US cross-domain response which culminated in a statement in a joint communique at the end of Xi Jinping's state visit to the USA in November 2015 that neither state would, and I quote, support or conduct cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. The precursor to this agreement had been a realization by China of the risk to its national champions from legal actions pursued by the US Department of Commerce within the WTO framework, and which, if successful, could have proven ruinously expensive. And the US approach does, on the face of it, appear to have had some results, as evidenced by the only slide that I'm going to show you. This is a graph produced by the US cybersecurity company FireEye, which purports to show a significant decline in cyber exploits originating from China since the end of 2015. I would caution, I would advocate caution when looking at this particular graph in isolation, because it's certainly not the case that China has ceased engaging in cyber-enabled espionage or has altered its concept of national security to match that of the United States. In that sense, I think the graph is potentially misleading, and I may actually reflect a degree of spin by the Obama administration. But I think what we are seeing now is a more discriminating approach that combines cyber reconnaissance with a greater use of human sources and a more discriminating, less all-encompassing approach to selection of cyber espionage targets. And in this context, it's important to remind ourselves there have been a range of Chinese actors involved in industrial espionage, from the intelligence services themselves through quasi-official militias and contractors to hacker groups operating without specific state sanction. And much of the activities that have taken place over the last decade have been somewhat chaotic and uncoordinated and characterized by relatively poor standards of tradecraft. China's embarked on its ambitious domestic agenda for integrating its real-world and digital economies, and, as I said before, sees digitalization as central to its next phase of economic and social development. And for this to succeed, it is clear that what has to date been a lawless and unhygienic environment does need to be cleaned up, and the wilder extremes of China's equivalent of the Beltway bandits need to be brought to heel in order to bring this about. It's also clear that China's leadership has been keen to stop China's intelligence services from moonlighting to the private sector, which is something they've been doing a great deal of, and to concentrate on using state capabilities for state purposes. So there is something of a rationale for the apparent shift in China's behavior, and as I observe in the book, I think we may actually look back at the past decade as something akin to the equivalent of adolescent growing pains. But at a strategic level, I think it's clear that China has established itself as a front-rank cyber-enabled intelligence power, and the question now really arises as to what its policymakers will make of the vastly increased streams of intelligence they are now able to access. In the longer term, it's the impact of cyber capabilities on China's defense and foreign policies that is likely to be far more influential in terms of impact on the strategic global landscape. Turning first to China's military, we've seen in the past 2 decades a remarkable transition from a low-tech, mass mobilization, land-based force focused on implementing people's war to a military, a modern military with an emphasis on naval capabilities that increasingly have a blue water component. And this reflects China's growing range of global interests, but also the reality that in military terms, China has sought to benchmark itself against the USA as its only meaningful peer competitor, an approach born of a determination not to let China ever again become weak and susceptible to the kind of bullying it experienced at the hands of the West during the 19th and 20th centuries. The PLA had a moment of epiphany during the first Gulf War when it realized how effective US precision-guided weaponry and US electronic warfare capabilities had become. And from then, it sought to pursue its own revolution in military affairs with Chinese characteristics. And this has included a growing awareness of the importance of information warfare, on which a range of military officers wrote extensively during the 1990s. The PLA, we should bear in mind, has had to face the challenge of moving to what they call informatization, whilst at the same time still pursuing mechanization and developing concepts and capabilities of joint operations, which are still fairly embryonic. The plans for modernization for the PLA are very ambitious, and I talk in detail in the book about what these amount to, and they raise lots of questions. How strong is the PLA's loyalty to the party? Might the existence of widespread corruption within the PLA erode its capacity to fight? How well might a PLA, none of whose current serving staff has ever fired a shot in anger, actually perform on the day? And beyond that, there are all sorts of questions about China's use, how China sees the use of armed force as a tool of statecraft. An issue which for most of Chinese history has been the subject of a cognitive dissonance that has sought to portray China as a peace-loving state in contrast to a reality characterized by a readiness to resort to military action on a very frequent and regular basis. And understanding the Chinese way of war, I think, is important contextually as to how the PLA's development of cyber capabilities will progress. I think in the event of China going to war with anybody, the cyber domain will clearly play an important part in shaping the conflict and enabling weapon systems on which the PLA is becoming increasingly dependent to function effectively. And the close nexus in Chinese thinking between cyberspace, space, and nuclear weapons in conflict is exemplified by the recent PLA reforms, which have led, amongst other things, to the creation of a strategic support force and a strategic rocket force, which is now a full-service arm. And the final, in my view, most significant area to be addressed in the book is that of China's foreign policy. After China came blinking into the daylight after the Cultural Revolution, it pursued a minimalist foreign policy amounting to not much more than a border management policy with the almost sole aim of ensuring a climate of peace and stability within which to pursue economic development. China seemed at that point happy to be a status quo power and to be a beneficiary of US-supplied international security goods. And as economic reform took hold, I think many in the West allowed themselves to be convinced that China would inexorably gravitate to the direction of Western liberal democratic values. I think very few people now harbour such expectations in the face of a Chinese state that in recent years has become much more unapologetic about espousing a very different value system and more assertive and instrumental in pursuing its interests and in demanding the respect that China increasingly believes it deserves and demands. This behaviour is especially evident in China's periphery, but also extends further afield. In the cyber domain, China has sought to use its gravitational pull as the world's largest ICT user community and potentially the world's biggest market for digital goods and services to pressure Western technology companies to comply with its own demands for things like access to source code and data sets. China has also begun to use its growing reach to intimidate and silence critics outside its immediate jurisdiction, a case in point being that of the Hong Kong booksellers. In the realm of international diplomatic discussion on cyber governance and cyber security, China has sought to erode the USA's dominant position in the cyber domain and to promote its own vision of a cyber domain by increasingly swarming the international agenda and using its national champions, such as Huawei and ZTE, to leverage influence in the developing world by providing core backbone networks at very favourable rates. It's becoming increasingly clear that China will no longer accept unconditionally the post-war global dispensation. And while China's values and ideology don't have an export model as such, they do have the potential to become more globally influential and possibly normative as a function of the country's growing global influence. In the conclusion to this book, I argue that when we look at the cyber domain and China's approach to this, what we appear to be seeing is China engaging in a massive global experiment in which the Western liberal democracies serve as the control group and, in effect, creating two parallel internets, two parallel approaches that may increasingly not intersect. Whether these approaches can coexist or whether one eventually becomes subsumed by the other will have pretty profound implications for humanity's future development. And I'll end on that point. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nigel, for a presentation which had a huge sweep to it and packed in a tremendous amount. We do have some time for some of your questions and and comments. And maybe I can just get the ball rolling, if that's all right. At the beginning of your presentation, you sort of curtain raised the issues that you've just been talking about, namely what sort of power China is going to be, with what level of dislocation and disruption for the rest of us, and what it would seek to do. To what extent do you think that some of the behavior that you've been witnessing and describing to us in the cyber domain, and which has also its diplomatic expression, is to be considered the new normal, China getting into the stride that it was always likely to adopt at a certain level of its development? Or is this simply a phase in its evolution that might not necessarily be a permanent one? I mean, you reflected in some of its attitudes towards cyber that perhaps there was an adolescent stage that was now being negotiated. What might the adult look like, if I can put it that way?
Well, I mean, this is a big question that everybody is addressing, and of course it's been the subject of intense and continuing debate within China itself. There is, within China's intelligentsia, no firm consensus on this matter. A fortiori amongst Western policymakers and experts, and we keep on getting very mixed signals. This takes me into the realm of futurology and prediction, which is something I try to avoid. But I do think that at bottom, China has this deep-rooted sense of itself as they call themselves the Middle Kingdom. I think this means something, as the largest and the most arguably the most powerful country in the world for much of recorded history, and I think it sees itself its relations with the rest of humanity in rather Confucian terms. In other words, I think that ultimately what China envisages is a world in which other smaller, this is an important word because I think scale matters here, countries understand and internalize China's concerns and preoccupations and implement these on a kind of preemptive basis. I think that I think is probably the ideal. But it's very much, as Deng Xiaoping said when he kicked off the reform process back in the late 1970s, crossing the river by feeling for the stones. And I think the adolescent analogy is one that I borrowed from a senior Chinese policymaker who made the point that some of China's actions were the consequence of being promoted into a global situation before they felt ready for it, before they were prepared, before they'd thought it through, and were constituted a response that was perhaps not as mature and considered as ideally it might have been.
Thank you. Any questions at this stage? Yes, please, front row. Just wait for the microphone to reach you and maybe say who you are.
Yves Guillaume-Messi from the Monk School of Global Affairs in Canada. I heard your discussion and it was fascinating to find out exactly what's been going on the governance end of things. But someone like Hank Paulson, who wrote the book Dealing with China, spoke about decades of strategic and defense economic dialogues, some of which actually seem to have touched on internet governance. Do you find that this internet governance sort of set of conversations at ministerial level for the past 15 years has had any effect on diminishing the risk that we do end up with a dual internet, the Chinese one and the global one?
Well, that is a very interesting and incredibly important question. And what we have been seeing for some time now is a fairly relentless and persistent effort by countries like Russia and China. And China has come late to this. It's really only in the last 2 or 3 years that China has adopted a more extrovert approach in all of this. Up until that point, it was more or less content to let Russia make the running and to kind of shelter behind it. But essentially, the agenda, the debate on global cyber governance has really divided into two camps. One, the so-called like-minded Western countries led by the United States that espouse the idea of an open, free internet and see cyber governance as something that is best left to be organic, the so-called multi-stakeholder model in which people who are interested to get engaged do so on a relatively informal basis, and the perception of countries like China and Russia that this needs to be a government-led, top-down approach, preferably conducted under the aegis of the United Nations. I do not think that there has been in recent years any approximation between those two positions. And we look at, for example, what's happening in the debate over the future of ICANN, effectively the organization that provides the Internet's global address book. Countries like Russia and China have for a long time now been trying to prize ICANN out from the control of the US Department of Commerce, under which it formally has sat up until now, and to turn ICANN into something like an international non-governmental organization, preferably located other than in the United States. That process is happening. It's starting to work. In other areas, like, for example, giving the International Telegraphic Union, ITU, a dominant role in cyber governance, this has not been especially successful. I think the battle goes on, and it is a battle, well, it is a war, actually, and I think it's going to run for some time. In the associated area of discussion on international security that takes place under the auspices of the UN First Committee through the UN Group of Governmental Experts, the focus has very much been on developing norms of conduct in the cyber domain, whereas actually what countries like Russia and China are pushing for is some kind of international treaty. The document that is being promoted in the United Nations is the Global Code of Conduct, which makes a regular reappearance in the UN General Assembly every year. The West will not sign up to this code. I don't think it's ever going to happen. But it's an approach that enjoys quite a lot of support within the developing world. So I think this is a situation that is going to run for some considerable time unresolved. I don't think the norms debate is actually going very far, and I think that it's beginning to look, to my mind, a little bit like an exercise in displacement activity.
One of the things you touched on in the talk was to relate the cyber domain to this notion of networked authoritarianism. And I just wonder how sustainable you think that is. I mean, you described it as the cyber domain as being a venue in which people can, under controlled and monitored conditions, let off some steam, a domain that serves a strategic purpose but requires regular sanitation and disciplining. How sustainable is that model, do you think?
Well, in the 1990s, when asked about this, Bill Clinton famously said that controlling the internet was like nailing Jello to the wall. I think the Chinese have found, with a history of technical ingenuity, have found a way to do it. And it's simply been done by throwing huge resources at the problem, massive resources. I mean, we're talking millions of people hired to monitor the internet, and the speed with which this can be done. During the Occupy Central demonstrations that took place in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, the umbrella became the dominant symbol of this movement. One smart aleck Chinese netizen posted on social media a photograph of Xi Jinping holding an umbrella. That post was taken down within 2 minutes of appearing, and just scrubbed from the team photograph. That is the speed with which this can be done, if needed. What's interesting about this whole thing is that it's still okay in China. I mean, notwithstanding everything I've said, Chinese social media is not a sterile sort of vapid domain at all. It's incredibly lively, noisy, rambunctious, just like China and the Chinese. And there's nothing to say you can't criticize the Communist Party. There's nothing to say you can't be rude about China's leaders. That kind of commentary, although less so than previously, is still able to go through pretty much without anyone doing anything about it. What really triggers the response is a suggestion that you might actually be about to do something about it, to organize, to set up some activity that challenges the Communist Party's authority. I mean, it's going to be many years, maybe decades, before we know whether this will be sustainable in the long term, and it depends on a great many factors. At the moment, most Chinese netizens are comfortable middle class, urbanites who have never had it so good. Life is pretty okay at the moment, and most of them don't want to rock the boat. So I don't think at the moment there's much that much of a risk. Though the Chinese Communist Party of leadership lives in a culture, of risk and fear. At the moment, as I said, I think they feel they've got technological dominance. I think they think they can hold the line, and more to the point, their approach, the international, this idea of cyber sovereignty, is gaining traction in the developing world. There is an international constituency that is very sympathetic to this. A lot of countries see unconstricted information flows as just as damaging and threatening to their hold on power as the Chinese Communist Party does. So they're never going to persuade us. They'll never persuade us, but it's a message that resonates quite widely around the world.
Great, thank you. Gentleman here in the second row, and then here in the front.
Yeah. Sorry. Hi, Brooks Newmark, IISS in Oxford. I guess just listening to you, cyber is something that can be offensive or defensive. What you've described is their ability to effectively nail Jello against the wall, domestically, defensively, in terms of stopping information, getting in and keeping an eye on what's going on domestically. Internationally, though, cyber power is relative, and their ability to be offensive is more tactical. We hear about perhaps where some of their successes are in the West, but we hear almost nothing about where our successes are in China. And I suspect the US, as always, is a question of do as I say, not do as I do. And their ability to project cyber power is much, much stronger, probably tenfold, than China's ability to do the reverse. And I'm wondering if you'd agree with that assessment.
Yeah. Well, I think at the moment that's probably true. Last year, President Obama, before the agreement with Xi Jinping was reached, made the point that if the USA and China were to engage in contest in the cyber domain, the United States would win. And I think that is undoubtedly true at the moment. And of course, this is another area where China is acutely neuralgic, particularly about its continuing dependence on US manufactured hardware and software. And it's very interesting to reflect that when the Chinese government wanted to develop a new system for itself, rather than go to indigenous manufacturers who could perfectly well have provided such a thing, they opted for an agreement with Microsoft, which I think is, speaks volumes about their continuing dependence. And there is this tension in the Chinese approach. They want to get out from under this dependence on Western technology, develop indigenous alternatives, insulate themselves from the risk of U.S. cyber attack to the extent possible. They are still some way from being in that situation. I think China's military have pretty much gone offline. They're on they're working on an intranet pretty much using fiber optic cables that are not that are effectively air gapped from the internet. But as we saw from Stuxnet, air gapping is not a guaranteed security solution. So there too, I think there are probably quite a lot of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So I think if it came to it now, yes, the United States definitely far greater capabilities. But of course, China's aim is to close that gap as rapidly as possible, and I don't think we should underestimate the speed with which they might be able to do it.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front here.
Hello, Hans van Leeuwen from the Australian High Commission. Just thinking about it on the sort of more soft power end of, perhaps you might call it offensive cyber. Thinking about a difference between Russia and China. Russia is alleged to either, as a state, either inspire or perhaps even organise trolling and general kind of intimidation through the social media channel. And it's reported that in countries like Estonia and Finland, journalists and activists and so on, and even public politicians can feel quite a sort of overwhelmed and cowed by this. I suppose China's limitation in that respect, they've got this enormous army of people who can focus on doing a similar kind of thing internally, but the firewalls and so on limit their capacity to perhaps do it externally. But could they, or do they, or might they sort of look at that Russian approach to a sort of a softer kind of lever of cyber influence in the international arena?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question, which is really, one that continues to preoccupy China's leadership, which is how they can do soft power, there is a huge effort going on now. Well, if I'm not mistaken, we've seen a deal with the Australian media where China has sought to project its influence very directly in Australia. There are lots of these activities going on at the moment. It is an issue, as I said, about which China's leadership are constantly obsessed. And the problem is, of course, that China potentially has quite significant soft power attributes until the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party takes a hand in things, whereupon it all goes horribly wrong very quickly. And that is something that I think the Chinese state is struggling with. We see this exemplified by the way that the tensions in the South China Sea are being handled in media terms. It's not really going China's way. I don't think we've seen anything like the same behavior from the Chinese state as from the Russian state. And I think at the bottom of this, we need to look at, recognize the very different approaches that Russia and China have taken here. Russia has developed some very formidable cyber capabilities, both legitimate and illegitimate. I think it's true to say that about 80% of all criminal cyber exploits seem to originate from Russia. That is the software, the actual technology to do them. And Russia's approach to the cyber domain has been driven entirely by the national security community, the FSB in particular. and the Russian state has not sought at any point to commercialize the very substantial capabilities that it has. China's approach has been very different in this regard. It's not just the national security community that has driven China's cyber policy. There have been many drivers, but the commercial and economic ones have been perhaps the most salient up until now. China, of course, has been notably successful in commercializing the expertise that it has acquired. And I think China wants to be rather careful about how its national champions are perceived overseas. So I think they're going to be fairly cautious about wanting to create any perception that China is going to engage in this kind of tsunami of offensive behavior that we see emerging from Russia. This is one area where I would expect Chinese behavior to be more selective and rather more discriminating.
Thanks. We'll take two questions at the same time, if that's okay. First, James Hackett, and then Antoine Levesque.
Thanks. James Hackett, IISS. You spoke a little bit about the debate on professionalisation within the PLA. I think it's really interesting. It'd be interesting to hear you elaborate a bit more about the cyber dimensions of that. And also the search for informationised warfare and warfighting capabilities. Do you think there's a sort of a dichotomy there between China's need to maintain control over the cyber domain and its growing band of cyber warriors and the monitoring techniques you've spoken about? And also, if you look at how they're developing capability in terms of military exercises, looking towards more free play, blue Op4 exercises of the sort that are practiced in the West. So, isn't there a dichotomy there? I mean, are they aware of the restrictive nature of the cyber capacities in the monitoring sense, and how that might actually hold back the search for informationized warfighting capabilities?
And then Antoine.
Antoine Levesque, IISS. Actually, my question's slightly related to James's question. Assuming there is a specific Chinese understanding of cyber being useful in a defense context, is that understanding being imparted to friendly countries within defense exchanges, for example? Do defense colleges in China, which receive foreign students from friendly militaries, actually come into contact with that specific understanding? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll answer that question first because I think it's a very easy question to answer. It's basically no. There is very little sharing, and China has been notably taciturn about what its own capabilities, doctrine, etc., do amount to. That was one of the problems that I had when actually writing this book, is that there is very little written down that represents formal Chinese doctrine that is in the public domain. So that has been a big challenge, and I think China recognizes that at the moment they are in a relatively vulnerable position here, and do not want to illustrate or allow to become visible the extent of those vulnerabilities, or what they're doing to address them. On James's point, I think, well, again, another huge question. I mean, we've seen a very significant evolution in Chinese military approaches to training exercises, etc. Once upon a time, these used to be very kind of set-piece exercises that had kind of predetermined outcomes. It's only relatively recently that the PLA has taken to using red and blue teams, and I think they are still struggling with military exercises where the outcome is not already predetermined. In the cyber domain, I think actually a bigger problem for the PLA at the moment is perhaps not the tension between allowing freedom of activity on the internet and the political domestic imperative to restrict that. It's a more basic and practical problem. They just don't have enough skilled people to do what they need to do, and in this sense they face exactly the same problem as pretty much every other military on the planet, including the USA. I think another interesting thing here in all of this is that in the 90s, when China first began to look at the whole question of informatization of armed forces and information warfare, there was a sense that China enjoyed a very significant asymmetric advantage, to wit, the United States and other peer competitors, to the extent that these existed, were, in the perception of Chinese strategists, critically dependent, dangerously dependent on network-enabled capabilities. And this was, at the heart of the book Unrestricted Warfare that came out during the 1990s. What's happened, I think, is that the Chinese military have retained this mindset of having an asymmetric advantage, whilst at the same time actively pursuing policies that erode that asymmetric advantage by becoming themselves progressively more dependent on network-enabled systems and capabilities.
And the last question to Ben Bilski, right in the far corner there. Just keep your hand up.
Benjamin Bilski, Berkeley's Foundation. Thank you, Nigel, for the book and speech. NATO a few weeks ago came out with the first statement that to treat cyber attacks as an act of war, which would trigger Article 5. And I was wondering if you can say anything, whether that's directed at Russia or also at China, whether China has shown interest in NATO systems. Obviously, there's the problem of attribution, of course. The question of the threshold matters as well, and I wonder what you can say about that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, some time back, I can't remember exactly when, but this has become, a fairly well-established precept. That Russia stated that an information attack could equate to, a kinetic attack. And that Russia would respond appropriately. China has been much more taciturn in this regard, and the formal Chinese position here has always been that we must, avoid the internet should be a zone of peace and development. That we must avoid talking about militarization of the internet. For fear of talking into existence something that's not there. Well, the problem with that is that it is there. That we're now, probably up to 100 countries have got some sort of military cyber capabilities. Over 40 have got associated doctrines, and this is all now happening. And it's bound up with the whole question of the applicability of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict in the cyber domain. And this is something I've spent many happy hours talking about with Chinese colleagues and counterparts. Of course, international humanitarian law is part of international law, and the UN group of governmental experts got an agreement 3 years ago that existing international law applies in the cyber domain. The Chinese response to that is, well, yes, but the question is, how do you do it? How do you do discrimination? How do you do proportionality? Et cetera, all these obvious, and how do you deal with neutrality? All these very obvious questions. China has not developed anything like a declaratory policy in this regard. We don't know what China would do, in the event of being on the receiving end of a cyber attack of real consequence that equated with maybe a kinetic attack. And I think actually that's part and parcel of China's general approach, and it's one of the things that make deterrence in this area very difficult. Whereas we in the West tend to see deterrence in terms of clear red lines and clear consequences for crossing those lines. Chinese concepts of deterrence are very, very different, and actually, fairly friable, designed entirely to ensure that in any given context, China has maximum flexibility to respond, and is not kind of corralled or forced into a specific response that might not suit it at the time. So there is a huge amount here, and actually that's one of the big areas on which I think this institute potentially has a great deal of work to do.
Great. Nigel, congratulations on the book. I know that you're planning in the next couple of months or so to roll the book out with the policy-making community in Washington and the business community in New York, as well as many other places. I'm pleased to say that for anybody who is here today and who hasn't already received the Adelphi as a function of their membership, can purchase it at a specially discounted rate of £10. Speaking of which, I thought that was a chart of sterling when you first put it up there.
Well, I was going to say, indeed, I didn't want to intrude in private grief.
No, okay, but thanks very much indeed, Manuel. Thank you.